I just thought of a story. One of the Sun Kings said, "Do you want me to leave you alone?" And I said to her, "You don't even know what's going on. Like, I wouldn't want you to leave me alone," I'm going on to say. And then I analogized what a story about a person like that would be. In a symbolic way, what is she really doing? And I started to think of how she is saying she could take me or leave me. She doesn't even care one way or the other. She's just turning their device just because it just seems better than just not spying on me. But she wouldn't even care if she wasn't spying on me. So I thought of a story about how she's an old woman with a pear tree, and she doesn't care about it. She could take it or leave it. She waters it because she gets pears, but she doesn't even need pears. She just eats them, and the whole time she's just always thinking, "I don't even need a pear tree. I'm just watering a pear tree and eating pears because it's just the same thing as not watering a pear tree and eating pears." So it feels like a storybook, like a children's storybook. It's like a lesson about it all, but I don't know where the story would go. But I thought if I said it out loud, maybe I would think of the rest of the story. Well, maybe if I tell it as a story, without thinking about the Sun King, or whatever the Sun King says or said, maybe it'll come to light. So I'll try it. There was an old woman with a pear tree, and it was a big pear tree in her living room. And she had a big picture window where the sunlight flowed through to give the pear tree light to keep growing. It was huge. It took up half of her living room. It was in a huge pot. It grew all the way to the high ceiling and spread all the way from wall to wall on both sides and one wall on the other side before it reached the middle of the living room halfway to the other side of the picture window, leading to the lawn where there weren't any other plants. And she didn't think anything of it. She just poo-pooed it all the time. She watered it faithfully. She took excellent care of it. It thrived, it blossomed, it blossomed, it bloomed. It was a pear tree jungle filling up their living room with lush foliage and big, juicy, giant-sized pears. She ate pear pie, pear cobbler, pear this, pear that. All the time, everything she ate was loaded with lush, juicy pears. But the whole time, she thought she could take it or leave it. She doesn't even eat pears. But there it was, so she might as well just keep taking care of it, she thought. And she talked to the tree. She often asked it if it wanted her to leave it alone or not. Well, her, actually, she thought of it as a woman. And, of course, it never answered. She never really expected it to. But she didn't really care about whether it wanted to be watered or not. She just asked it every now and then anyway, just to prove that it just didn't really care. And therefore, she wasn't at fault for keeping the poor thing alive and well for so long. She had started growing it from a seedling many, many years prior to the lushness of the tree being so great that it actually broke a pane portion of the picture window glass one day as it grew a branch right through the window. So it had actually gotten bad at that point, and she was surprised because she thought it just wasn't anything to her. But there it was being bad all of a sudden. She suddenly had a grave conflict to deal with. To approach the tree as that real was suddenly almost more than she could bear, and she broke down on her knees in the living room on the floor in front of the tree, crying in despair, realizing she was taking care of a real live organism that really mattered. It was shocking to her beyond belief. She fell to her side and bowled over on the floor under the foliage of the pear tree. She looked up and saw the leaves surrounding her, the lush fruits surrounding her, the shadows of the sunlight flickering on the ceiling past the foliage and fruit. And then she looked again at the broken pane of glass with the pear tree's branch breaking through into the backyard. But she was going to have to do something. But if she was going to be real, what was that going to do to the rest of her life? She could stop watering it, she thought. But it mattered now, so it was too late to stop watering it. She had her chance for many, many years, but she lost the chance to stop watering it. So she could snip the branch, but then just more branches would grow. She could move the part, but where? The tree was so big, there was no way she could budge the part. She could trim it so much that it would start over again. She thought maybe she would do that. So she went to the tool shed and pulled out the garden shears and brought them back into the living room and started to trim the tree close to the trunk, and branch after branch fell to the floor. She snipped and snipped and snipped and snipped until all the leaves and fruits and branches, except for just a few remaining on the trunk, were on the floor in a heap of dead foliage. And she sighed a great sigh of relief. She had done the right thing. But there it was, though, still there, the real tree. And was that the right thing to do? She began to wonder, after all, because it was still alive. It was still growing. How else would it still be there? But she could stop watering it now, except she was guilty of trimming it. She could not really justify not watering it, because then that would be even worse than trimming it practically to the bone of the skeleton of the poor thing. She could not murder it. She would be even worse off that way. So she nursed it back to the fullness of the tree it was before. And she gave it room to grow its branches beyond the picture window, leaving the window half open from top to bottom, with an extra pane she added that tilted inward, and it grew into the lawn area of her surrounding yard. And she let it keep growing to the sun, and it reached the only tree of the lawn, and she trimmed it again there because it was going to mess up the growth of the tree, strangling its branches with unfurling tongs of strangulating life. So she didn't think the tree deserved that. So she trimmed the pear tree again all the way back to the trunk, with a few short strands of branches remaining, knowing full well it would just grow back. When there weren't any fruits on the trimmed tree, she didn't have any pears to eat, and she didn't miss them. It didn't matter. She had plenty of pear preserves on hand in mason jars in the basement beneath the living room that she ascended down to now and then, especially when the fruits were not on the tree anymore. But one time, when she went to the basement, she didn't find any more preserves. She realized she had eaten them all. She had not saved any. And that was the time she trimmed the tree away from the one in the lawn, which wasn't a fruiting tree. It was just a maple tree. Well, then she thought maybe she could take the sap from the maple tree to sweeten her sweet tooth some more in the light of the lack of the preserves. But what was she going to eat with the maple syrup? She wondered. Well, she thought maybe she could fry the pear leaves instead of throwing them away. Maybe they could be greens. So she made salad greens out of the pear leaves and sweetened them with maple syrup from the tree on the lawn. And she kept eating that and preserved it too in mason jars until more pears had fruited on the branches of the pear tree in the living room. And she heard maple syrup, pear leaf preserves still remaining when she started adding more pear preserves in the mason jars of the basement. So she decided to try mixing the leaves, the syrup, and the fruit together. And that's when flies started to invade the house. So many flies, she didn't know what to do. The flies told her whatever she was eating was not really fit for human consumption. It was more like maggot chow. The flies apparently were fruit flies, not common house flies, and they started to infest the pear tree in the living room. It started to wilt with the infestation of the fruit flies, eating the flesh of the pears and sending their maggots into the leaves and kernels, burrowing through them into the branches. And she had no way to control the fruit fly infestation, and the tree was on the way out. It was dying. And it was all her fault. If she had just saved some pear preserves, she wouldn't have made the pear leaves and maple syrup preserves. But it was too late to fix the problem. The tree was getting worse and worse and worse, and she was getting more and more and more guilty as the days rolled by, and she couldn't get rid of the fruit flies. They had burrowed a mainstay into their tree. Was not just their home, it was their lifeblood, their passion, their desire. They were in love with the fruits and the leaves and even the branches they danced for and lit up at night as she build another fire in the fireplace of the living room on the other side of the space empty of the tree. She thought the fire might scare the flies away. Well, they liked it even more. It warmed their gizzard and gave them more incentives to burrow even further into the trees' leaves and dance even more rapidly upon the branches as they feasted upon the fruits. She withered in front of the fire, in the fireplace. She felt like pushing herself into the fireplace as she lay upon the floor in front of the fireplace. The tree behind her rustled in the cold breeze blowing through the open window. She thought maybe she should turn it into firewood and let it warm her home. At least she wouldn't be guilty of making use of it that way. So she took her saw from the tool shed and brought it back to the tree in the living room, and she sawed the tree from the base at the top of the surface soil of the huge pot, and the tree fell to the floor of the living room in a huge swoosh that shook the room and threw soil all over the floor of the living room and sent the fruit flies scattering through the air in a frenzied swarm. All over the living room atmosphere. The tree was there. She saw on grain side relief. It was older. Finally, she wasn't guilty of taking care of a pear tree in her living room anymore. She was never going to have another pear tree ever again. That's what she thought anyway. She started to chomp it up with an axe from the torture into little pieces and started to throw them into the fireplace on the fire. And soon the whole tree was burned to a crisp in the fireplace. The only remaining aspect of the tree was the pot full of soil, the huge pot with the Mexican pinata design on it of a bear, as if it were made of paper mache. It was really clay. It made her wonder what might really be in it. So she took a shovel from the tool shed and brought it back to the pot and started shoveling the soil to see if there were treasures in the pot. She found a bunch of roots, stiff roots, and the whole rooted mass she threw onto the floor with the rest of the contents of the pot. There wasn't anything of a surprise, just a bunch of soil and a knot of roots on the living room floor. She started to chomp up the roots too with the axe. She shook off the soil and threw the roots into the fire. But then she started feeling really guilty because she could propagate another tree from the roots, she thought. So she left a little bit remaining, the middle part, the main stem of the root. She didn't throw into the fire out of her sense of guilt about it all. She then, to relieve herself of the guilt, put the soil back in the pot. The remaining soil still on the living room floor. She shoveled back into the pot, and then she planted that small main stem of the root system back into the middle of the top of the surface of the soil, enclosing the root stem with more soil, and she lifted up the watering pot and watered the soil. And in a few days, the root had germinated another set of tiny leaves peeking out from the soil. She could not let go of the pear tree. The pear tree was there for life. It was an eternal tree of life. She was doomed to have a pear tree throughout the ages of her life and into the eternal doom of foreverness. Onward she would go, for then she knew it was her blessing and her curse to live with a pear tree, as if that's all she was to be in life. An old woman in a pear tree. She looked out through the picture window, past the maple tree to the horizon as the sun set that night. the sun didn't look any different than it ever did before. She got her mason jars ready for more pears. She shooed the fruit flies out of the house. She closed the picture window for now and kept the house warm. With the fire from the fireplace as the pear tree began to grow up again. The moral of the story is the song is stuck with me for life. And if she wants to be singing, then that's how she's a parenting. And that's how I'm an old man in a parenting. She won't be standing there to be real if she really is a songing. She might be just as much of a songing as a pear tree is a tree. That's not a very pleasant thought, but it's a story nonetheless.